Coming up on the program, we're going to be discussing the causes and lead up to the American Civil War. Welcome to the program. Today we are discussing something that is every fan of American history, every historian has a rich story to tell or a great interest in the American Civil War. The bloodiest war, brother against brother. Joining me to talk about the root causes and the lead up to that bloody war is West Kentucky Community and Technical College professor Brent Taylor. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Daniel. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we hadn't done one in a little bit. I think the last time we were talking about presidential assassins, maybe, but we're talking about something equally as dark, I suppose, the Civil War.
One of the darkest times.
And, of course, one of the bloodiest. It is true, right? It is still one of the bloodiest conflicts in our history.
American military history, #1 in terms of body count. That is correct.
That is what I thought.
Which is surprising because you think, oh, the World Wars. And it's bigger than World War II. It's much bigger than World War I. It's 10 times bigger than Vietnam.
It's an intensely personal war, too, because we're talking about neighbors, and as the phrase is, brother against brother is often said, especially in the border states.
That's right. The way I've always thought about it is everyone's always upset about politics in our current time. Magnify that by shooting at each other.
Yeah. Yeah,
and it's not pleasant.
And unfortunately, it left scars on the face of America for over, nearly a century later. They're still grappling with issues related to that. First, we want to get to some of the causes. So obviously, slavery is a major part, the main part of the lead up to the war. But let's sort of pick one. It all starts kind of Henry Clay, Kentucky's Henry Clay, and his final moments of political power, right? The 1850 Compromise. Okay,
right. So that's the crisis of 1850. And the crisis doesn't really sound like a crisis on the surface level. You say, oh, there's a crisis. What is it? California wants to be a state.
Okay.
That's the crisis.
About half the country today would have a problem with that. But
it's a whole new crisis, right?
Yeah.
But back then, they applied for statehood as a free state, and the real problem there is politically, because that means that the free state people get 2 senators.
So they're really keeping count of who's the free state guys and who the slave states are, because obviously if there's ever more of one than the other, then the status of power changes. Yes,
and that's the whole thing about it. I mean, imagine in today's time a 2-senator swing in the votes. That would be everything.
Had states that had been admitted always been free states up to that point?
No. There had been a crisis of 1820, and in that crisis, Missouri wanted to come into the Union as a slave state. So it was the same kind of dynamic. The free state people didn't want them to get 2 senators.
So it's the same game, just 20 years later, 30 years later.
Yeah.
So what happens in this crisis? What's Henry Clay do, the great compromiser that he's known for being?
In the clutch, when you absolutely positively have to have a compromise, that's Henry Clay. He's the great compromiser, so we bring him in and he says, we've worked these things out before, we can do it again.
We're going to deal on this, basically.
Yeah. Because that's what grown-ups do. They don't demand everything to be their way. In fact, he's got a really nice speech about this. That look, people are objecting to this because it's a compromise. Well, in a compromise, you give up something to get something. Both sides.
Sounds like today a little bit.
It always cycles.
Missing, maybe. Yeah.
It always cycles. And so California comes in as a free state. They basically open the Southwest to the idea of slavery. It's not a done deal, but it's politically, they're going to make that a potentiality. Then they banned the slave trade in D.C., which was a big point for the abolitionists. And then the other piece of it is we're going to have a new Fugitive Slave Act.
What does that do?
That will make it easier to return runaway slaves.
Even if they go into a free state then?
Yes.
Okay.
And the terms of that were very controversial. It involved, if you know something, then we're going to charge you with aiding and abetting and all this stuff. So it was really more controversial than the original controversy in some ways.
If someone had, say, escaped to a free state and they were aided by someone hiding them there, then the people that were helping them hide and escape would also be prosecuted.
That could put the liability onto you, yes.
Wow, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
So I can see how that would be controversial and problematic. What was the outcome? What eventually happened?
So eventually it did all calm back down again like it had with all the previous blow-ups of its type. But it's considered usually one of those first steps towards the war in the 1850s.
Obviously it didn't go away. Even though, so do you think the compromise, well intended as it was, ultimately led to the Civil War? How does it ultimately get there?
Usually the way that's viewed is it forestalled it. So you're buying more time.
So Clay kicks the can down the road, metaphorically speaking.
Right. Now in the moment they felt like it was solved.
Well intended, yeah.
Right, but the underlying causes are still there.
And then a really sort of famous, to anyone who's a historian or interested in the Civil War history, Bleeding Kansas is another one. So you're having these states that are having all kinds of internal issues going on. So talk about Bleeding Kansas, and there's a familiar name, John Brown, who will recur again. He's also involved in this.
So long story short on that, popular sovereignty was going to be the solution to slavery again.
Allow the people to vote.
Yeah.
On whether or not they wanted to have slaves.
Up or down, do you want it in your area or not? Leave Congress out of it. Very American.
I see problems with that, though.
Well, there were. The problem was they had the election. And in the election, there were more voters than registered voters.
People were going into the state. They were traveling into the state to influence the election. So, like, was there no record of who was a citizen of the state that had the right to vote? I wonder.
That I'm not as sure about, but the numbers of votes far surpassed the registered voters.
Everybody's involved in Kansas.
Yeah, and then some. You know, you're 100+ voter turnout, which is not possible. And both sides declared victory. Both sides accused each other of shenanigans, and then it was actually a miniature civil war.
Really? So there was a civil war sort of within Kansas there.
Yeah.
Talk about that. What happens there?
So that's John Brown on one side, and then you've got some pro-slavery people on the other side, and they were killing each other over it in small battles.
Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating to me. You know, we think about declarations of election, and, you know, with 2020 and the things that we see today, like, this is all smacking of the mid-19th century. So claims of election fraud and all that is not something that's, while we all seem shocked about it in the headlines, it's not something that's particularly new in America.
It all cycles around.
What about a famous book that everybody's heard of, Uncle Tom's Cabin? So why is this book I think it's one of those books that a lot of people have heard about but maybe haven't read. What is Uncle Tom's Cabin, and how did it contribute to that?
When Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said something to the effect that, "So you're the little woman who started this big war." And that was the social impact that it had. I think the issue with it is it's in a fictional form, but then that's making people who read it say, well, I wonder if that could be true.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's anything like this in real life.
Yeah.
And it just kind of opened that can of worms for maybe someone in Wisconsin who hadn't ever thought about slavery before.
It allowed for popular culture, I suppose, to take it over too. Oh, you're right. So a richer person or someone that's disconnected from South and slavery, you know, might either relate to it or sympathize with it and want to see about its end. So that would impact the political decisions of the North too, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
I've once heard it referred to as being like Thomas Paine's Common Sense was for the American independence movement. Would you say that's a fair comparison?
Yeah, I'd say they're both really big publications, widely read, and the impact definitely is felt there. For sure, I'd say that's very fair.
I think it's one of those books that a lot of people, like I said, they have heard of it, but it's not something that they've taken time to read, and if they do, they would find themselves probably shocked by the language used in a mid-19th century book.
Oh yeah, and that goes for speeches, and not even just fictional works and things like that. But absolutely, it's kind of like the disclaimer that you see everywhere, right? Like this was written in a different time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a whole different vernacular.
And another one too, and this is where Harper's Ferry also is in the lead up to. And how close in these events that we've talked about are they? This is all within the same decade, right?
Yeah, so essentially you're starting there at 1850, and then you're going to go step by step. Every couple of years, one of these things is happening again.
And that's just sort of stirring the pot that's already in existence, that's
Right.
already happening. It's not having time to simmer and cool off. It's
Yeah, it's like they're coming with more frequency than they used to.
they're just turning it up as they go. And so what happens with Harper's Ferry that is so flammable, shall we say?
So John Brown denied this, but the way that it was viewed in the South was that this was a grand scheme to arm the slaves, start a slave rebellion, and end the institution once and for all. We're going to raid a military facility where they've got guns, take the guns, potentially turn those over to slaves, and then just watch the thing
slave
naturally.
revolt, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, kind of like Spartacus style slave revolt.
That is so fascinating. And is that perceived as an act of treason or anything like that? How is that treated by the military or by the federal government?
So the military did respond to this. In fact, it was Robert E. Lee who was.
Wow, a
the guy
familiar name
responding.
folks will learn a little bit later.
Yeah, exactly right. And then John Brown ended up on trial. And in that era, anything with that sort of disorder attached to it, tried, convicted, executed.
So that was his fate.
Yeah.
He's sort of martyred too, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. In
Talk
the
about
North,
that, yeah.
they sang songs about his dead body. John Brown's body, a moldering in the grave.
And he's sort of a legend as an abolitionist
Oh,
who,
yeah.
Was willing to put his own life ahead of the moral cause of anti-slavery, of
Yes.
abolitionism. And the fact that Lee shows up is so fascinating because it's not going to be much longer that he's a
Right.
major player in the war. Which gets to, one of the other major things is there are going to be some folks that run for president in 1860. There's this
Right.
new party that's forming that still exists today. This is sort of the beginning of when the two-party state begins as we know it, although differently aligned.
Yes.
The Democratic Party's existed since Andrew Jackson.
Yes.
And now the Republican Party is going to come to be.
Right.
Talk about how that forms. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of different parties, right?
Okay, so video killed the radio star, and the Republican Party killed the Whig Party. It's primarily old Whigs, but then there was also kind of a strong third party called the Know Nothing Party for a minute, and so they're taking maybe a little bit of support out of there, and it's going to be a conglomeration, but primarily the Whigs.
And if you had to put them on a political scale, you would say the Republican Party at this time is more left on the spectrum and the Democratic Party is more right-leaning.
Yeah, so the Republican Party is going to be the more active, larger government kind of party, exactly right. The Democratic Party is going to be viewed as more conservative.
And then that leads to, Abraham Lincoln, of course, runs for the Senate in Illinois against Stephen Douglas, which leads to really well-known and published speeches that they give, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which are, they're just like, you take turns, right? You're allowed to make notes, and that's it.
Yeah, so sometimes you lose the election but become a star. Sarah Palin, somebody like that. In this case, that happened with Lincoln. He lost that election. Douglas won, but he became a star.
But that also was a time when the legislature got to pick the senator, prior to the 17th election. And his positions on slavery really did him quite a controversy. He has unique views at that time, right?
Lincoln or Douglas?
Lincoln.
Both did. Lincoln, it's kind of funny. He's definitely not a pro-slavery guy by any stretch of the imagination. He also kind of viewed himself as bound by the limits of the Constitution and things like that. And so when he comes to run for president, his position will be nuanced. It'll be against the spread of slavery.
So future states, but not where they are right now.
Right. The territories especially,
That's
we
kind
want
of a
slavery out
centrist
of there.
approach because his challenger in the Republican primary, William Seward from New York, is well known as kind of a liberal of his day, and he wants it outlawed everywhere, right?
So he had made a controversial statement in the middle of the primary that we'll paraphrase here, that slavery and freedom were in this classic struggle. Mm-hmm. And that was viewed as essentially too radical. And so Lincoln is going to be the moderate choice within the primary.
Okay, so let's talk about that primary. So you've got the Republican Party that's now a combination of all these different leaders, political leaders, including, Salmon P. Chase, who would later on be in the cabinet, and Seward, and Stanton, who would be defense secretary or war secretary later. It's quite a primary, right? How do all they shape up against each other?
So Seward is the clear front runner, and in fact, he won the first ballot and the second ballot at the convention.
So he's the favorite at that point.
Yeah, I mean, going into this, you would have had your money on him. The betting odds, like they do today, you would have had the betting odds for him to win that primary. Lincoln is kind of like Mr. Everybody's second favorite.
So they all liked him well. He was a second. So it wasn't like he was an unknown quantity. They liked him well.
Yeah, in that convention, I mean, he's a strong candidate. He's just not the front runner. Mm-hmm. And then when it becomes clear that we can't get all the votes that we need up there with Seward, then more votes start going to Lincoln.
What does Seward do that's the mistake?
From what I've read, it was those controversial statements.
That statement about freedom. And
that one in particular, yeah, that kind of hung
and so
out
that
there.
Allowed Lincoln to sort of surpass
Gave him maybe the little window that he
could
needed.
pull enough votes from up here to.
Yeah.
So, and campaigning back then was a lot different too. Like they didn't go to those conventions, right? They sort of like had their guy there and would often make deals.
Right. Campaigning in general, it really wasn't done. Except for Douglas. Douglas campaigned for himself in that election. None of the rest of them did.
That had to have been different, right?
Yeah, it was controversial. In fact, there's a political cartoon of this where it says Stephen finding his mother.
Uh-huh.
And what happened was somebody caught him campaigning. And they were like, hey, wait a minute, you're out campaigning.
You're not supposed to do that.
Yeah, that's against the unwritten rules.
Isn't that kind of the thing that's like the one who wants it shouldn't get it? It's like the anti-ambition thing.
I guess that's where it came from, but it just really wasn't done. It was seen as distasteful.
I find it funny because it's like if you told them today where you just had to be like, you just have to be out there, put your stuff out there, but you're not allowed to campaign. People go crazy. The candidates wouldn't know what to do.
Yeah, it's really been a sea change since then. But anyway, he lied about it and said that he was visiting his mom, and so then he just happened to speak a little on the way.
I gave a little speech on my way to my mom's house. Okay.
Right. And everybody saw
I'm going to use that if I ever run for office. Hey, it's just on the way. And so how does Lincoln, Lincoln becomes the nominee of the party.
Yes.
And then this is not your traditional general election either. There's a bunch of different candidates in this race, right? There's like 4 candidates in it.
Very unusual. The two-party system was already very strong at this point, but I guess the country's so fragmented, the Democrats could not agree on a candidate. Mm-hmm. So we end up with 2 different Democrat nominees.
Well, you just know what that's going to do, right?
That's the classic split in the vote.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened there. The Northern Democrats went with Douglas. The Southern Democrats went with John C. Breckinridge, so vice president, very strong candidate. Mm-hmm. And then there's a viable third-party candidate, which is John Bell.
Bell, yeah.
Yeah, of Tennessee. And he's a former House Speaker. So this isn't like just some guy you've never heard of who's there for some reason on the ballot.
These are all like titans of politics at the time,
yes.
Sort of being on the same metaphorical stage together.
Yes.
So do you think that Lincoln saw the writing on the wall and imagined that was his for the taking at that point because of the split in the Democratic Party?
I have read that the mood at the Republican convention was pretty happy.
Yeah. Although he also had to look at the issue of, now that he's the nominee going to likely win the election, there's also consequences associated with that too, right?
Oh, of course.
Lincoln was the one that was like he's like, if it's him, we got big problems, right?
Well, the Southerners in particular were kind of like an anybody but Lincoln section of the country at that time. And then as it going to play out on actual election day, Lincoln runs very strongly in the North. He got all those things. Douglas is kind of running second best everywhere, but second best doesn't get the job done in the Electoral College.
No, right. You can be 48 or 7, but if you're 51, it's over.
Yeah, so he actually ended up with over 1 million popular votes, which is a big number back then, but not even 20 Electoral College votes.
He was close in the popular vote, but not the Electoral College. That's how, like you see today, landslides. But if you really look at the numbers, it might be closer than it appears.
That was exactly the way that this was. And in fact, if you add the other 3 candidates together, it's more popular votes than what Lincoln got.
Wow, that's the art of the game, right? So
Right, and it's just the way the numbers go and everything. And so then when the dust settles, Lincoln is president, but 6 out of 10 people voted against him.
That is so complicated because, like, there's no mandate. Or he might feel like he's got one because of the numbers in the Electoral College, but the voters in the South and the border states might not feel the same way.
Right, and his election is the trigger. They were willing to sit through that election, see if they can get a Breckinridge, probably accept a Bell or a Douglas. But in their minds, Lincoln was unacceptable. So the Southern Democrat reaction to this is going to be Abraham Lincoln, comma, not my president.
I see. Very, very smacking of the same kind of culture we have today. What he has an inaugural speech to give in March, so obviously he has a moment where he can kind of try to pull the country back together. So what does that look like? That
would be the last and first chance, which is kind of weird, to try to save the country. Because as president-elect, 0 power. As president, your first act is the inauguration speech.
You set the tone.
You set the tone. And so he did. He came out, and it was very kind of serious, somber. But also at the same time, it's logical. He's going to walk you through the formation of the Union in that speech, where it came from, why we believe that it exists, what it is, that it's perpetual, that it's assumed to be perpetual, and that it's always grown, it's never kind of shrunk before. And then in the closing moments of the speech, he's essentially going to put all the cards on the table. Up at the beginning, he told you, look, I'm not going to touch slavery in the states where it exists. If anybody's told you that, that's not right. So I'm not as as radical as people say. And then the closing moments of the speech, we must not be enemies. He says that verbatim. We must not be enemies.
And there's a lot of tension in that. It's crazy to think how close they were because they were already anticipating something breaking out. I heard that they had the military prepping for...
Well, there had been rumbles of this since the 1830s.
Yeah. And then, obviously, unfortunately, for the country, the speech did not take, which leads to the attack on Fort Sumter.
And that's going to be it.
And that is the ball game. And we'll have to come back and talk about, the war and then its conclusion another time. But it's just crazy to me that, all these things within a decade lead up to the kickoff of a civil war that would be one of the bloodiest war that we ever have.
Yeah, and you can just see the little points building.
It boils, but then it doesn't, it eventually boils over with the attack on Fort Sumter, and Lincoln tried his best to preserve the Union and ultimately does, sacrificing himself in the process. So, well, thank you, Professor Taylor, for talking with me, and we'll do this again soon.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Thank you. That's our show, The American Civil War and the Causes and the Lead Up to It. Thanks for watching, and join us next time.